Tēnei te mihi māhana ki a koutou katoa, ko hui hui mai nei I runga I te kaupapa o tēnei ahi ahi. Ki te tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, te Aotearoa taranaki whānui, tēnā koutou. Ki te mana whakawā o te whare, tēnā koe. Ki ngā mema o Paremata, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Señoras y señores, muy buenas tardes, todas y todos. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm not going to repeat the long list of acknowledgements by Matthew, but it's wonderful to be here and sharing this afternoon with you. For me, it's a real privilege and a delight to be asked to chair this panel. As Matthew mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be posted to Mexico many years ago and served as the Deputy Ambassador there, which for me was both a personal and a professional highlight. And I'm really delighted to see George Troop, my ambassador, here joining in the celebrations tonight. We know that bilateral relationships are built on culture, connection and commerce, and that New Zealand has invested over many years in the Latin American strategy in building those relationships with Latin America, and in particular with Mexico, with a focus on people-to-people links, business connections and government-to-government relationships. And it's through people physically travelling between our countries and immersing themselves in the culture that we can build authentic relationships and then allow commerce and collaborative approaches to some of the global challenges we face possible. I'm looking forward to hearing the reflections from the recent Speaker's delegation to Mexico and to hear from the Director General about his visit to New Zealand for foreign policy consultations. In 2005, when I was posted in Mexico, I had the pleasure of accompanying a New Zealand Speaker's delegation to Mérida in Mexico City. The delegation, led by the Speaker, Margaret Wilson, included a number of MPs, including Nanaia Mahuta, who of course is now our Foreign Minister. The delegation met with counterparts in the Mexican Senate and Chamber of Deputies to discuss shared interests and to advocate for stronger economic relationships. Now, of course, we have the CPTPP. The delegation also met with the National Committee for Human Rights, a reflection of where in international fora New Zealand and Mexico are often like-minded, as was mentioned by both of our ambassadors. And a lasting memory for me was an outdoor dinner in the warm evening on the Mérida cobbled streets and escorting Minister Mahuta on a horse-drawn carriage ride with her and her husband, perhaps not quite the romantic moment that they might have envisaged, but it was a real opportunity to reflect on the challenges that were facing Indigenous peoples in both of our countries, talking about representation, equity, language revitalisation, and these are conversations that endure to today. So on that note, I would like to invite to the stage our panel members for this afternoon. Can I invite the Speaker, the Right Honourable Adrian Rurawhe, to join us on the stage here, and also the Member of Parliament, Ricardo Menéndez-March. And then I think we'll also have a contribution online from the Director General. Kia ora koutou. Muy buenos días, Director General. ¿Puedo invitarle a presentar sus palabras?
Hello, can you hear me correctly?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Good afternoon in New Zealand and good night in Mexico, where it's almost 10 o'clock at night. So to start, my first proposal to foster relations between New Zealand and Mexico is that the next meeting takes place at 9 a.m. in Mexico and at 10 p.m. in New Zealand. On the serious note, to begin, it's a great pleasure to see again the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Adrian Rurawhe. I had the pleasure of meeting you, sir, here in Mexico City, enjoying excellent Mexican food. So it's great to see you again. Great to have heard the remarks of the director for the Latin American Center for Asia Pacific, Dr. Matthew O'Meager. Great to have heard the remarks of Ambassador Alfredo Pérez Bravo. Un gran saludo a Nueva Zelanda, Ambassador Sarah Maymond, and all the distinguished members of Parliament and the diplomatic corps that join us here today. So to start, allow me to make a bold statement. We are now starting a new era in the Mexico-New Zealand bilateral relations. And why do I say this? After 15 years, after all, we have many successes in our diplomatic ties. But also we have to acknowledge that after 50 years of bilateral relations, we have some wrinkles in the bilateral relations, and it starts to make a facelift, to adapt to the world and regional challenges that we both face. Mexico, let me tell you, is eager to remark this anniversary as the occasion to launch a comprehensive reinforcement of our bilateral relation, recognizing the new opportunities adjusted to the complexities and changing international scenario. So let's start. What did we get right in the first 50 years? And Ambassador Maymond and Ambassador Pérez Bravo highlighted some of these aspects. I will start by saying that we have both sewed together initiatives to maintain international peace, stability, and security in the world stage. We have promoted trade and investment opportunities to support economic growth. And we have shared the objective of diversifying our export markets and building together stronger economic relationship. And today, after all, we are trade partners under the CPTPP. For Mexico, this is a major fulfillment to know that trade with New Zealand is boosted by a modern legal framework. Of course, the relationship between Mexico and New Zealand cannot be discussed without recognizing our affinity on multilateral affairs. We have worked along within several multilateral fora, pushing together initiatives of matter of the greatest importance as human rights, climate change, peace and security, and disarmament. And as a matter of fact, we find disarmament issues one of our top shared core values. I see that Roberto Dondich will speak later, so I won't get in depth as I presume he will in the next panel. But let me share that one of my first assignments as a Mexican diplomat within the 2000 MPT review was to work with New Zealand in the new agenda coalition, one of my first assignments. So what can we do for the next years? And the good news is that we're not departing from zero. And in the Asia Pacific region, both countries have maintained a commitment towards the fulfillment of international law, of freedom of navigation, and human rights. And also earlier this year, as it was commented in the introduction, I had the privilege to visit Wellington at the 8th Senior Officer Talks along my colleague, the Director of the Americas of the MFAT, Catherine Graham. And we were able to identify specific topics that would lead our work together to foster our bilateral relations along with our embassies, our industry, our civil societies. Top of the list, of course, indigenous peoples cooperation, agriculture and mutual access to agri-food products, increasing bilateral health cooperation, trade, disarmament, and multilateral cooperations in global issues. And of course, all these ideas were not spontaneous, but a sign of the similarities and values that join us as defenders of multilateralism and the international rules-based system. Of course, economic cooperation will be crucial in the coming years for both our countries. So what do we propose? Of course, keep strengthening our trade ties, fostering investment opportunities through CPTPP, promoting business collaboration, joint ventures, supporting startups in both countries. All this will stimulate economic growth and create jobs in both our nations. New Zealand can leverage Mexico's strategic location as a gateway to North America And of course, New Zealand's expertise will be key for Mexico and the region in areas of agriculture, renewable energy, and technology. But let's not forget the most important aspect, which are people-to-people ties. Let's focus on education and cultural exchanges as well. And just let me conclude reflecting on my perspective for the future of Mexico-New Zealand relations. We must, of course, embrace the idea of keeping, having formal and informal constant consultation to address the most critical issues of the international agenda. Let us take advantage of our coincidence to develop forward-thinking policies and cooperation mechanisms on peace and security, on the functions of supply chains, on how to face new pandemics, on climate change, on disaster management, and many aspects of the fourth industrial revolution, including artificial intelligence. To summarize, despite the enormous geographical distance that separates Mexico and New Zealand, it is more than clear after this first 50 years that we are closer than ever by virtue of our shared values. I was privileged to witness personally during my trip to Wellington the massive potential of our relations, besides attesting the warming and friendly style that Kiwis apply on their public lives in their person-to-person context. So cheers for another 50 years. Salud a todos, and thank you for Mexico City. It's been a privilege.
Gracias, Director General González. Thank you so much for sharing the reflections on your recent foreign policy consultations. I like your acknowledgement that we are very, even though geographically distant, that we're very close. I know I like to think of us as neighbours across the Pacific. Can you highlight for us any particular insights that you draw from your visit to New Zealand recently, and perhaps any specific topics? You mentioned that the foreign policy consultations touched on a number of areas around Indigenous peoples cooperation, promoting business linkages and startups. Are there any new initiatives that you may be considering to support the ongoing cooperation between our two nations?
Well, yes, as I mentioned, in the indigenous aspect, I'm very happy to have attest that both our competent authorities, at least on the side of Mexico, they've made already specific proposals to their New Zealand counterparts, also in the area of agribusiness, very, very important, and very happy to assess that we're working very good together in terms of CPTPP. I expect the delegation from the Ministry of Economy going to Wellington to the next ministerial meeting that's going to take place next month. So this is going to be very important. And to highlight, and it's an aspect of the next table as well, that we both coincided in this regard, that we have to multilateralize our bilateral relation. That is not only to speak of areas and aspects that directly link us bilaterally, but also assessing the challenges in the Asia-Pacific region, and also identifying issues that we can keep pushing together by initiatives in the multilateral fora. Sarah mentioned, of course, issues with the SDGs, which is very important, but the environment, disarmament, peace and security, our shared values in terms of peacekeeping operations, which is very important, to name a few.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Director General, and we certainly look forward to hosting the delegation from Mexico and New Zealand next month. Mr. Speaker, if I may turn to you, may I first congratulate you on the report back from your visit that was done in video format and uploaded on the website. For those who haven't seen it, I think it's a really accessible way of sharing some of the insights from the delegation in a much more, in a way that's going to perhaps connect with some of our younger generations. But may I ask you to share with us some of your reflections from the delegation that you led to Latin America, and specifically why is the first delegation that you led as speaker, why you've chosen Latin America to focus on?
At the time that I was asked to lead the delegation to, to somewhere in the world, I was deputy speaker, and I was asked by the then Speaker of the House. I was part of the group that decided where this delegation would visit. The Parliament goes through a process. Maybe I could just briefly explain about speaker-led parliamentary diplomacy, because it's a really important part of our interparliamentary relationships around the world. We hear a lot about government-to-government relationships, so this is parliament to parliament, and that's why delegations are cross-party. And so we have representatives from across the whole parliament. The former speaker asked me, where would you like to take a delegation if you led one? And I thought for a moment, I thought, Latin America. I would love to visit there. I was given a list of places around the world that the visits had taken place recently, and I noted that there hadn't been one to Latin America for quite some time. And so I suggested that we go there. That was quite a while ago, and then he delegated to me the responsibility of leading that delegation, and then not long after that he decided that he was retiring, and then I was elected as speaker, and it changed from being a deputy speaker's delegation to being a speaker's delegation. Should I shoot right to my overall reflection about the visit to Latin America, and say this. One thing I came back with was that I think, and I agree with Fernando, people-to-people relationships are really important, and I think our young people from Aotearoa need to go to Mexico, and young Mexicans need to come to New Zealand. And I think those are the kinds of conversations. If I evaluate everything that I saw and learnt, I think that was one big takeaway for me, that I felt that we should promote and embark upon. I think, and the reason I say that, I felt that we had a lot more in common than I thought we would have. I think the values are things that we appreciate, are very similar with each other. I think, and this is true for the whole of all 4 countries that we visited in Latin America. I think the way that we were hosted and looked after was really amazing. And the other reflection, it was great having Ricardo with us in Mexico. As a son of Mexico, I think we had a really great opportunity to learn probably things that we wouldn't otherwise learn about the country. And a personal highlight was being able to stand in the Senate and deliver a speech, to speak in Te Reo Māori in their Senate, and have Ricardo translate it into Spanish, which was, I'm not sure that's happened anywhere in the world at any time. And saying that too, I must say some of the feedback that we got on our visit, we had a very diverse group of members of Parliament. And it was pointed out at one meeting that we attended, we've got a Māori, a Samoan, a Mexican, a Chinese and a Pākehā. Sounds like the start of a really bad joke. And when we were introducing ourselves, if the opportunity arose, I did encourage everyone to use their mother language. And so I think in at least one or two events, we heard Mandarin, Samoan, Māori, English and Spanish.
Is this working? This one now? Thank you so much. You mentioned that there's not much attention paid to parliamentary visits and the particular value add that having the conversation Parliament to Parliament has. Can you explore or share with us a bit more about what you perceive the conversations that you had in Mexico in particular add to the bilateral relationship?
Yeah. Is this working? Oh, it is working. Yeah. I think, as I said, it was cross-party, and so we leave the country to visit overseas, and we leave our political differences behind. And we are there as New Zealand parliamentarians. We have an obligation, I think, to promote our country. We can have, conversations, but we don't take the politics of our differences away with us as well. They might emerge in some form, but and that would be true of visiting delegations to New Zealand as well. We keep our home politics at home. But I think it's a really important part of being a member of Parliament and having that opportunity to learn about how other parliaments work, how their society works, how their government agencies work as well, and trying to get an understanding of what's important to the people of the country that you're visiting.
Kia ora. And I really like your reflection that there's so much cultural similarity, I think, between New Zealand and Mexico, and particularly when it comes to concepts of manaakitanga and whanaungatanga, and the real focus on hospitality and family that is certainly demonstrated in Mexico. What were the other sort of points of resonance, may I ask, from your trip to Mexico? Or were there things that surprised you from an experience that you had on the ground there that you wouldn't necessarily have known from New Zealand?
Yeah, there's quite a number of things. The recorded history and the demonstration of that history to us, and the importance of it within modern culture of Mexico as well. I think that came through really clear for us. I think I left one particular meeting wanting more and knowing that the only way I'm going to get that is to actually go back again, which I would love to do and determined to do. But yeah, those at a personal level, I do enjoy reading and hearing about historical events, and actually, seeing the way that it's displayed and recorded and valued was a really great experience.
I think the point that you made about ensuring that there's opportunities for our young people to visit each other's countries, a particularly important one, and I hope the working holiday scheme still continues and we continue to be able to facilitate that exchange.
Yes, well, I've had those conversations and will continue to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ricardo, may I now turn to you and ask you about your experience as a member of the speaker-led delegation to Mexico, and particularly as a son of Mexico, what your reflections were returning to Mexico as part of a New Zealand parliamentary delegation, and how you may have seen Mexico differently, having come from a New Zealand experience and a New Zealand parliamentary experience in particular.
Yeah, kia ora. So having lived the first 18 years of my life in Mexico, and predominantly in Tijuana, Mexico, but also acknowledging the importance of building those peer-to-peer parliamentary relationships, I think for me one of the highlights was the opportunity to learn from the work we each do. And I think often to actually acknowledge that the lessons can go both ways. For me, for example, one of the interesting highlights in terms of the discussions that we were able to have was that Mexico was actually ahead of New Zealand when it came to the banning of conversion therapy, which we had just recently banned at the time of our visit. And so it was insightful, for example, to get feedback and insights about how banning that practice was going in Mexico. And sometimes we forget that in the region, sometimes there are countries that are pioneering specific pieces of legislation or programs, and that we can look up to actually for lessons on what has and hasn't worked. I think that was a really interesting lesson, I guess, an insight. I mean, I knew that, but it was an interesting insight to kind of see the engagement of other parliamentarians who were interested in the topic, and who were actually left, in my view, with a desire to learn more about what else we can learn from the region as well in terms of policy areas that they may have already put in practice that we're looking at.
And in the video clip of the visit, I noted that there was a short part of you doing the translation of the speaker's presentation in the Senate. Can you tell me about the sort of the language revitalisation kōrero that you may have had while you're in Mexico, and where Mexico is at, and what opportunities there might be for a further exchange in that particular area?
Yeah, I think language revitalization was a theme across every country that we visited, and certainly one that came across in Mexico. I think it's important to acknowledge the nuances and complexities in each of our countries when it comes to the topic of language revitalization and the different lived experiences of colonizations in each of our countries. But I do think it's an area where there's a lot of potential cooperation. And when we talk about the people-to-people exchanges, we learn so much about each other by the sharing of language and culture. And I think that is something that can bring us closer together, and I think there's heaps of appetite to work in that space. And not to challenge, I guess, the geographical, the point that has been made several times about the distance between the two countries. I do want to remark that it is actually Mexico is geographically a lot closer than a lot of our closer the partners that we deem, I guess, in the public arena to have a relationship with. And the issue of language revitalization is a topic that I think can bring us even further close together, both in terms of the shared challenges, but the initiatives that are happening both here and in Mexico that are working to revitalize each country's respective indigenous languages.
Yeah. And may I ask you, as New Zealand's first Latin American MP, what was it like for you to return to Mexico with this new responsibility that you have here in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think acknowledging that, for example, like Nancy Chen, who was in our delegation, is traveling with the Prime Minister to China. There's a lot to gain from engaging with parliamentarians who have that background and delegations, whether parliamentary or government delegations. I also don't purport to represent every Mexican, and I think that for me is a really important thing to take into account, that I have a very specific experience of living in Mexico and grew up in Mexico and being part of the Mexican community. And it's something that I value deeply when it comes to engaging with legislators from Mexico, and that I acknowledge that they themselves would have completely different experiences to mine. But where I think having someone like myself going to these delegations, or having people who have those experiences going on delegations, is that we can also engage with the legislators from Mexico in topics like the working holiday visa. And having had a cousin, for example, who was held one of those visas, I was able to engage from a lived experience point of view in terms of understanding whether those bilateral arrangements were working and how they differ from other countries. So I think there is a lot of value in engaging with parliamentarians and these delegations who actually will understand some of those topics from a lived experience point of view.
I imagine both your lived experience and your ability to share with the delegation insights about your own country that perhaps might not have been obvious otherwise would have been incredibly valuable to the delegation. May I ask if there were any unexplored opportunities that you identified in your travels?
Well, actually, one of the things I did during the trip was sneakily took, and hopefully MFAT's not like freaking out, but I sneakily took the speaker and the delegation to a Mexican diner. And I do think cuisine and is an area that is left unexplored. Like, I'm really heartened to see small businesses being set up in Mexico where actual Mexican cuisine is being offered. But for too long, I think people's, New Zealanders' experiences of our culture has been through a Tex-Mex lens. And so I think there is far more that we can do because everyone in the delegation's perception of Mexican cuisine was so different from what they probably had experienced here. And just very briefly, in terms of other areas that are left unexplored, topics around even our experiences of crime and safety in prisons, like that we met with community groups who were doing work with the embassy around people's experiences in Mexican prisons, and particularly trans people's experience in Mexican prisons. That is a topic that has been a hot, live debate here in the past. So I think there's more that we can do to tap into the appetite of grassroots activists who are working with our embassy to actually bring that work and highlight it here as well.
And I'll thank Ricardo again for the opportunity of having pozole. For me, I think the conversations that we had at the embassy with former students that had come to New Zealand really embedded within me the value of those experiences for those people, and also experiencing what life is in New Zealand, sharing with me their experiences within the Māori culture as well, and giving me a deep insight and the ability to understand that we're probably missing out on a huge opportunity, because I think there'd be a number of young people from my community which could value from having that same experience, and I know that they won't necessarily ever get that experience. I think that the focus for a lot of young New Zealanders of an OE means you go to Europe, and I think there's a missed opportunity. As you said, we're separated only by water. It's not a lot separating us. It's a pretty big piece of water, but nonetheless, we're virtually next door neighbours. We are next door neighbours. But yeah, I think that, as I said before, that was my overall takeaway from it.
Kia ora. Well, I think we now have some time for questions from the audience, if you have any. May I ask that if you do have a question, I see Craig's looking at his watch, so I'll be
And before we go into that, I told the speaker and the organizers I have to go back to the house to contribute to legislation. So you'll have to excuse me for the question and answer session. I apologize for that, but I'll be back here for the closing remarks.
Muchísimas
Kia ora.
gracias.
Thank you.
If there's anything I can't answer, I'll tell them to ask later. Okay?
May I ask that if you do have any questions that you raise your hand, and I think we have some microphones, or we can invite you up to the microphone here so it can be captured for those who are joining online. Kia ora. Well, if there's no questions, then may I say, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for sharing your reflections on the visit, and it's a real delight to hear your focus on the connections between our peoples and the need for us to ensure that we're getting our young people to experience each other's cultures. I think there's lots of work that we can do there and that the Capes can be supporting. Kia ora.